The cold, firm grip of the security officer on my elbow stopped me mid-stride. I heard the sharp, metallic screech of folding chairs scraping against the concrete, followed by the sudden, heavy silence that always precedes a public disaster. Then came my mother's voice, sharp as a razor blade and aimed directly at my back. "Throw her out. She is no officer." I did not flinch. I did not jerk my arm away. I simply planted my boots and turned to look at the man holding me. He looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the front of the formation where my brother, Tyler, stood in his dress uniform, staring resolutely at the flag. "Do you have a security clearance, sir? Or are you just taking orders from a civilian with a grudge?" I asked, my voice steady, barely above a whisper. My father stepped into my line of sight, his face a mask of practiced disapproval. He wore his veteran lapel pin like a badge of moral authority. "Morgan, you have been out of the service for years. You are embarrassing yourself, and more importantly, you are embarrassing your brother. Leave now before we have you escorted out in front of everyone." I could smell the familiar mix of expensive cologne and mothballs that clung to his suits. It was the smell of my childhood, the smell of appearances being kept at any cost. I looked past him at Tyler. My brother would not look at me. He just checked his watch, his jaw tight. "I am a colonel in the United States Army," I said, keeping my tone flat. "I have an invitation. I have my identification. I am not leaving until this ceremony concludes." My mother moved closer, her eyes glittering with that specific brand of maternal fury she reserved for when I refused to play my part. She leaned in, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "We told security you were a civilian relative with a history of mental instability who might try to wear a uniform to cause a scene. Do you really want to test who they believe?" The humiliation of it washed over me, cold and predictable. I felt the rough fabric of my sleeve bunching under the officer's grip. This was the trap. They had been building this narrative for months, brick by brick, making sure everyone at the installation thought I was the unstable, bitter sister who couldn't handle her brother's success. "I am not leaving," I repeated, looking directly at the security officer this time. "Call your protocol officer. Verify the invitation. Do not touch me again." The officer hesitated, his grip loosening just enough for me to pull my arm free. He signaled to his partner, and they stepped back, though they did not leave. They were waiting. My father let out a sigh of exaggerated patience, preparing to address the small crowd that had begun to murmur nearby. Before he could speak, the rhythmic, heavy sound of boots on stone echoed through the auditorium. The formation shifted. Major General Celeste Ward was marching toward us. The room went absolutely still. I knew her, but she had no reason to acknowledge me here. She walked past my father, past my mother, and stopped directly in front of me. She looked at me, then at the two security officers who were still hovering nearby. "Colonel Morgan Hale," she said, her voice carrying easily to the back of the room. "It has been a long time." She snapped a crisp, perfect salute. I felt the air leave my lungs. I raised my hand and returned the salute, my movements practiced and precise. A moment later, the commanding general turned to the formation. The officers who had served with me during Lantern Bridge reacted first. One captain rose and saluted. Then another officer followed, not because protocol required it, but because they understood what Major General Ward's gesture meant. The recognition spread through the room in a measured wave. Some officers remained at attention, others offered the same voluntary salute. No order had been given. That was what made it matter. My parents stood frozen. The color had drained from my mother's face, leaving her looking suddenly brittly old. My father's mouth hung slightly open, his hand still frozen in a half gesture toward the door. Major General Ward did not look at them. She looked only at me. "I heard you were in the area, Colonel," she said, her tone professional but laced with something else. Something like an unspoken warning to anyone listening. "It is an honor to have you with us today." She turned then, her eyes finally sweeping over the stunned faces of my parents, and I knew She knew. She had seen the security complaint. She had seen the attempts to define who I was before I ever walked through those doors. The security officer who had grabbed my arm was now pale, his gaze fixed on the floor. I stood tall, the weight of my own uniform suddenly feeling like armor. The ceremony was supposed to be about Tyler, but in that single, silent gesture of salute, the entire narrative had shifted. My father tried to speak, his voice thin. "General, I think there has been a mistake. My daughter, she..." Major General Ward did not wait for him to finish. She turned back to me, her expression unreadable. "Colonel Hale, please, join us in the reserve seating. We have much to discuss regarding the promotion proceedings," she said. I nodded, my heart hammering a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. I walked past my brother. He didn't look up, but I saw his hand clench at his side. I didn't need to hear what he was thinking. I already knew. As I moved toward the front row, I noticed my father's phone vibrate in his hand. He glanced down at the screen, his face twitching. I caught the tail end of a text notification before he shoved the phone into his pocket. It was from Tyler. The screen was dark now, but the timing was perfect. I took my seat, waiting. The trial was not starting here. Not today, but the record was being set. And for the first time in years, the record was finally going to show exactly who was wearing the uniform and who was just wearing the lies. Maya's townhouse was the only place in the world that felt like mine. It stood on a quiet, tree-lined street 3 miles from the installation, a sanctuary where no one ever asked me to shrink. The front door clicked shut, muffling the memory of the auditorium, and I leaned against the frame, letting the adrenaline finally drain out of my legs. Maya did not say a word. She headed straight to the kitchen, the soft clinking of ice against glass telling me she was already pouring 2 fingers of bourbon. She understood that some nights required silence, and tonight was a requiem for the family I had spent years trying to keep afloat. I dropped my bag on the entryway table and went straight for the built-in desk in the living room. My hands felt steady, but the cold, hard reality of what had happened at the ceremony burned behind my eyes. I reached into the hidden compartment of the mahogany desk, a spot no one in my family knew existed, and pulled out a worn blue field notebook. It was heavy, the cover stiff from years of storage. Opening the spine, I felt the rough texture of the waterproof paper against my fingertips. There, in my own handwriting, were the maps from 6 years ago. Operation Lantern Bridge. Every line of the evacuation framework, every timing sequence for the 3 corridors, and that distinct, handwritten rule about the 4-minute quiet window, it was all there. I had mapped it out when the world was literally coming apart around us, and the only thing standing between the team and disaster was the logic I had pulled together under fire. I sat down, the blue notebook open like an anchor. Maya walked in and placed the glass on the desk, the condensation leaving a ring on the wood. "Are you going to be all right, Morgan?" she asked. Her voice lacked the pity I hated. "I am more than all right," I said, tracing the lines of the diagram. "I am finally finished with them." 6 years. 6 years of watching Tyler build a career on a foundation he never had the grit to pour himself. I thought of the night I had sent him that memo. It was a year after the operation, and he had called, his voice thick with the desperation of an officer who realized his own research was hitting a wall. He had been so humble then. I had been weak enough to want, just for a moment, to be the older sister he looked up to. I had cleaned the memo of all sensitive markers and left only the core operational framework. I sent it with a clear instruction in the subject line, "For study only. Use this as a reference. Do not present the work as your own." He had responded within the hour. "Thank you, Morgan. You are the only one who gets it." I took a long drink of the bourbon, letting the heat burn away the taste of my parents' voices in the auditorium. They hadn't just looked away, they had participated. Every step of the way, they had helped him polish the lie until it gleamed. I opened the evidence ledger on my laptop. It was a document I had been building since last November, the month Captain Leah Brooks first contacted me. Leah was a junior officer, brilliant and terrified, trapped in Tyler's unit. When she opened the training deck Tyler was using to teach his platoon in front of me, I had felt the floor drop out from under me. There it was, my framework, my logic, my specific terminology. And attached to it was a slide with Tyler's name, touting him as the sole architect of the method. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just started saving. Emails, transcripts of speeches, PDFs of award narratives, and every single text message my mother had sent me, complaining that I was bitter or unstable whenever I dared to ask for credit. I had it all. My phone vibrated on the desk. A voicemail. It was Tyler. He had left it while I was still in the auditorium. I pressed play, and his voice filled the room, sounding polished and desperate. "Morgan, for God's sake, call me back. Dad only changed the wording because your version was too easy to recognize. We were just trying to keep the family in the loop. You have to fix this." I paused the recording. My breath hitched, not from sadness, but from the sudden, jarring clarity of it. Dad only changed the wording. He hadn't just known. He had been the editor. Maya stood by the window. "Do you think they ever had any intention of stopping?" she asked. I looked down at the blue notebook. They weren't just protecting Tyler. They were erasing me. They had decided that my contribution was a resource they could harvest. "I am not the sister I was back then," I said. "I spent 6 months in physical therapy, 6 months in counseling, and 2 years learning how to build a house that they didn't have the keys to." I started typing, my fingers flying across the keys as I updated the entry in my ledger. I added the timestamp of the voicemail and the context of the training deck Leah had sent me. I was playing for the record. Later that night, the house finally grew quiet. I lay in bed, the blue notebook tucked away, but my mind was wide awake. I had given Tyler the tools to be a better officer, thinking he would use them to serve the team. I had given my parents the benefit of the doubt, thinking they were just biased, not corrupt. But the truth was a jagged edge, and I had been holding it for a long time. The next morning, the sun rose over a world that felt different. I woke up knowing that the game had shifted. They thought they could handle me with the same old threats, with the stories of my recovery, with the accusations of instability. They were wrong. I walked into the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. Maya was there, ready for her shift. "Are you ready for what comes next?" she asked. I thought about the hearing Ortiz would eventually lead. "I am ready," I said. "It is time to see who is actually standing when the noise stops." I set the mug down and picked up my phone. I didn't call home. I opened my official email, drafted a concise update to Ortiz, and included the transcript of the voicemail Tyler had just left. I wanted him to see, in plain black and white, exactly what my father had admitted to. It wasn't a rant. It was the truth, and for once, the truth was not something I was going to apologize for. I looked at the blue notebook one last time. It was just a book, but in it lay the architecture of my brother's undoing. He thought he had outsmarted me by stealing the words, but he had never understood the spirit of the work. He didn't know how to lead when things were dark. He only knew how to take credit when the lights were bright. And now, the lights were coming for him. I turned off the computer and walked out into the bright morning, leaving the past in the dark where it belonged. The fear that I had carried, the fear that I was the problem, was gone. For years, I had been the sister who stood back, the one who stayed silent. But that Morgan was gone. The woman who stood in that auditorium yesterday, the one who returned the salute to her general, was not a ghost. She was a colonel, and she was done being invisible. The car ride to the installation was smooth. Maya drove with a steady hand, her presence a quiet reminder that I had built something real. I didn't need the validation of my parents to prove my worth. I had my team, I had my friends, and I had the truth. I arrived at the headquarters feeling lighter than I had in years. I walked up the steps, my posture straight, my resolve fixed. Today, the investigation began in earnest. I reached Ortiz's office, the hallway quiet and professional. I knocked once and stepped inside. He looked up, his expression serious, his desk covered in the files I had provided. "Colonel Hale," he said, gesturing to the chair. "I'm glad you're here. We have a lot of work to do." I took the seat, the weight of the moment pressing down on me, not as a burden but as a challenge. I placed the blue notebook on his desk. It was the beginning of the end, for the lies. Tyler might have thought he was the golden child, but he had never learned the most basic rule of military service. Honor is not a status you hold, it is a standard you uphold, even when it costs you everything. And I was about to show him exactly what that price looked like. The investigation would be thorough, it would be meticulous, and it would be absolutely, unforgivingly true. As I sat there, looking at the man who would eventually uncover every piece of the fraud, I realized that I wasn't just clearing my name. I was reclaiming my life. I talked for hours, walking Ortiz through the documents, showing him the trail of breadcrumbs Tyler and my parents had left behind. When I finally finished, the silence in the office was profound. Ortiz leaned back. "Colonel," he said, his voice quiet, "this is unusually well organized. The timeline will make the independent verification much faster." I left the office as the sun began to dip below the horizon. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. I was home, and I was whole. I arrived at Maya's townhouse and walked inside. The silence of the house a welcome comfort. I took off my jacket and hung it up, the weight of the uniform no longer feeling like a burden, but like the armor I had earned. I knew the coming months would be difficult, but I had faced down disasters in the desert, and I would face down the lies of my family. I had the truth, and as long as I had that, I was invincible. I poured myself a glass of water and walked to the window, watching the stars begin to emerge. My family thought they had me figured out. They had been wrong for a long time, and now they were going to pay the price for it. I closed my eyes, the memory of the salute still fresh in my mind. It was the salute of an officer to an officer, and in the end, that was all that ever really mattered. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Ortiz possessed an office that stripped away pretense. Gray walls, a desk devoid of personal photographs, and a window overlooking the orderly geometry of the installation parking lot. He sat across from me, his posture suggesting a man who had spent 2 decades listening to people justify their sins. He opened a manila folder, the paper sliding against the desk with a sound like dry leaves. "Colonel Hale," he began, his voice a neutral baritone, "I have spent the last 72 hours reviewing your preliminary ledger. You have categorized your claims into 3 buckets: false attribution, integrity of official records, and the security complaint filed by your parents." I nodded, my hands folded on my lap. I wore my service dress uniform, the fabric crisp and heavy. "What is your objective?" Ortiz asked, watching my face for the flicker of a vendetta. "I want the record corrected," I said, keeping my gaze steady. "I want the framework properly attributed to the team that built it under duress, and I want the false security complaint expunged. I am not looking for a firing squad. I am looking for the truth to be the official record." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Most people in your position want a head on a platter. The truth is heavy enough for them to carry," I replied. He pulled a sheet of paper from the file, a partial copy of the security complaint filed on the morning of the ceremony. It branded me as an estranged civilian with a history of psychological instability and a potential propensity for impersonating a commissioned officer. Reading those words felt like being struck in the chest, yet I forced my lungs to expand. Ortiz pushed the complaint toward me. This document was the catalyst for the security protocols enacted during the ceremony. My investigation will focus on the source of the private medical information included here. You have stated you never shared this with anyone outside of your immediate family. That is correct, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I had trusted Nancy with my vulnerabilities years ago, never imagining she would weaponize my recovery to save Tyler's promotion. She did not just repeat a rumor, Colonel, Ortiz said, his voice dropping. She signed her name beneath it. The betrayal was not a sharp, sudden cut. It was a slow, agonizing realization that the person I had tried to protect for 2 decades had been sharpening her knife while I slept. I need corroboration for every entry in your ledger, Ortiz continued. The blue notebook is a start, but it requires independent verification. I leaned forward. I have spoken with Major Isaac Grant. He was the planning officer for Operation Lantern Bridge. He remembers the framework and the initialed pages in my notebook. He is willing to provide a formal statement. Ortiz marked his notepad. Good. What about the communications? I slid a stack of documents across the desk email chains with Tyler from the year after the operation and subsequent communications with Nancy, including metadata and timestamps. When we finished the review, Ortiz stood. We have a mountain of work. Do not speak of this to anyone. Tyler Hale and the others will be interviewed separately. You will stay off the installation to avoid any appearance of witness tampering or retaliation. I walked out of the office, the air feeling thinner. My head pulsed, but the ledger was open. The investigation was live. I met Isaac in a quiet corner of the cafeteria. He looked tired, his eyes heavy with the weight of someone trying to hold a crumbling unit together. Morgan, he whispered, looking around. I saw the news. Tyler has been pulled from his morning briefings. I kept my hands on the table. It has to be done, Isaac. He is pushing junior officers to erase my name from the training decks. You know what that does to the credibility of our planning. He nodded, his jaw setting. I have my statement ready. I kept copies of the original planning annexes. They aren't classified, but they are detailed enough to show the framework originated with you. Thank you, I said. I spent the afternoon at a small public library, the stacks providing focus. My phone sat face down, vibrating periodically with messages from Nancy, Tyler, and Kenneth, the trinity of my former life, calling out for a reconciliation predicated on my silence. I kept a ledger of every attempt, adding them to the file I would later present to Ortiz. Late in the afternoon, Nancy called. I answered. Morgan, she began, her voice trembling with practiced sorrow. Do you have any idea what you are doing to your father? He is calling everyone he knows to tell them you are having a breakdown again. Mother, I said, my voice steady, do not call me to threaten my career with stories about my health. I have the security complaint you signed. I am not having a breakdown. I am having a legal proceeding. Her tone shifted instantly, the softness vanishing. You are a cruel, bitter woman. You always were. You think because you wear that uniform, you can destroy your own family? You didn't protect me, I said, coldness settling into my bones. You protected a lie, and you used me to build it. Do not contact me again. If you have anything to say it through the legal counsel now handling the investigation. I hung up, the silence of the library rushing back in. I wasn't shaking. I felt a strange, quiet expansion in my chest. I had finally severed the cord. That evening, Maya was waiting with dinner and a glass of water. We are going to be okay, she said, not as a question, but as a fact. I believe you, I said. The investigation would bring scrutiny, but the truth was no longer a secret I had to protect. It was a tool I was ready to use. I spent the evening organizing the digital records. I created a secure cloud drive, a digital bunker where the evidence could not be tampered with. Every timestamp was verified, every source documented. I looked at the file labeled Nancy, and I didn't feel the sting of her words anymore. I only saw the evidence of her intent. She had signed her name on the complaint and provided the evidence of her own malice. It was a tactical error I could never have imagined her making, but she had been so confident in her ability to control the narrative that she had ignored the paper trail. I went to bed early, my sleep undisturbed. The silence in the townhouse was absolute, a clean slate. The next morning I woke up knowing the game had shifted. They thought they could handle me with the same old threats, but they were wrong. I walked into the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. I thought about the hearing Ortiz would eventually lead. "I am ready," I said to Maya. "It is time to see who is actually standing when the noise stops." I opened my official email, drafted a concise update to Ortiz, and included the transcript of the voicemail Tyler had just left, plain black and white proof of what my father had admitted to. The house was quiet, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a void. It felt like a foundation. I looked at the blue notebook one last time. It was just a book, but in it lay the architecture of my brother's undoing. He thought he had outsmarted me by stealing the words, but he had never understood the spirit of the work. For years I had been the sister who stood back, but that Morgan was gone. The woman who stood in that auditorium, the one who returned the salute to her general, was not a ghost. She was a colonel, and she was done being invisible. I arrived at the headquarters feeling lighter than I had in years. I reached Ortiz's office, knocked once, and stepped inside. He looked up, his desk covered in the files I had provided. "Colonel Hale," he said, gesturing to the chair. "I'm glad you're here. We have a lot of work to do." I took the seat, the weight of the moment pressing down on me, not as a burden, but as a challenge. I placed the blue notebook on his desk. It was the beginning of the end for the lies. Tyler might have thought he was the golden child, but he had never learned the most basic rule of military service. Honor is not a status you hold. It is a standard you uphold, even when it costs you everything. The investigation would be thorough, meticulous, and absolutely true. As I sat there, looking at the man who would uncover every piece of the fraud, I realized I wasn't just clearing my name. I was reclaiming my life. I talked for hours, walking Ortiz through the documents. I kept my voice steady, ensuring every fact was backed by a source. When I finally finished, the silence in the office was profound. "Colonel," Ortiz said, his voice quiet, "this is the most organized case of integrity violations I have seen in my career." I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips. For the first time, I felt heard not by my mother or father, but by the institution that actually mattered. I left the office as the sun began to dip below the horizon, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. I was home, and I was whole. The official envelope arrived on a Tuesday, heavy and stark against the hardwood of my entryway. It carried the crest of the installation command, the kind of paper that made the air in the room feel thin. I sat at the kitchen table, the silence pressing against my ears, and waited for my hands to stop their involuntary tremor before I broke the seal. Inside was a formal notification. Major Tyler Hale's promotion board had been officially suspended pending an integrity review. My pulse hammered against my collarbone, a steady, rhythmic reminder that the machine was finally moving. I was not jubilant. I felt a cold, sharp clarity, the same sensation I had known years ago when checking the wind speed before a chopper lift in the desert. My phone rang. Tyler's name flashed on the screen, but I didn't answer. A text followed immediately. "We can still settle this, Morgan. Just talk to the board and say it was a misunderstanding about permission. If you do this, I will make sure Dad stays out of your way." I set the phone face down. His attempt to negotiate felt pathetic, a desperate grasp for a power he no longer held. He still believed that everything in our lives, every achievement, every setback, was negotiable. He didn't understand that the currency of his life was no longer valid. I spent the morning at the desk, cross-referencing his award packet with the sanitized memo I had sent him years earlier. The discrepancies were glaring. He had tweaked the phrasing and deleted the attribution, but he had left the 4-minute quiet window exactly as I had drafted it. It was a digital fingerprint no amount of smooth talking could erase. Around noon, Ortiz called. He sounded drained, his voice tight with the strain of navigating the political minefield I had invited into his office. "We have the award packet, Colonel," he said. "There is a signature page here from Colonel Avery Sloan. She is listed as the endorsing officer for the narrative." My throat went dry. Avery Sloan had been my mentor during Operation Lantern Bridge. If she had signed off on Tyler's deceit, then the betrayal ran deeper than I had ever feared. "I need to see it," I said, my voice barely holding steady. Ortiz agreed to a meeting, but he warned me to be prepared. If Colonel Sloan has endorsed this, the board will consider it a heavy point of evidence in his favor. I drove to the installation with a knot of dread tightening in my gut. I had avoided thinking about the possibility of Sloan's complicity. Inside Ortiz's office, the packet lay open on the desk. The signature was crisp, black ink on white paper, Avery Sloan. Below it, the date was stamped with machine precision. My heart faltered. Why would she do this? She knew the timeline. I stood there for a long time, the silence humming with the weight of the document. Then, something caught my eye. The paper quality of the signature page felt slightly different, a fraction thinner than the narrative pages that preceded it. I reached out, my fingers hovering just above the edge of the sheet. "Do you recognize the signature?" Colonel Ortiz asked. "It is her signature," I said. "But the page routing it doesn't look like her usual work." Sloan always inlined her routing sheets with blue ink notations. She was a fanatic about documentation. She kept hard copies of everything in her personal files. I turned the page, looking for the blue ink. It was blank. The margins were skewed, suggesting a photocopy or a cut-and-paste job. "They didn't just steal the work," I said, the realization settling over me like cold water. "They stole her signature. They scavenged a support memo she had signed for a completely different purpose years ago, and they grafted it onto this packet." Ortiz leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "That is a serious accusation. If that is true, we are not just talking about attribution theft. We are talking about the manipulation of official records." I remembered the way Sloan handled her files. She was incapable of allowing a piece of paper to be misused. I pulled out my phone and sent an urgent request to the office where Sloan had retired, asking for her old routing sheets. By the end of the day, my mother had sent 4 more emails to my personal address. Each one was a variation of the same theme: how I was a disgrace, how I was led by bitterness, and how I would regret this once the family's reputation was destroyed. I didn't open them. I moved them into the folder Ortiz had asked me to maintain. I was not their victim, and I was not their confessor. I sat in my apartment that evening, the blue notebook open. I was thinking about the signature, the audacity it required to forge a superior officer's endorsement. It was the act of someone who believed they were untouchable. Tyler hadn't just been careless. He had been arrogant. He had forgotten that I was the one who had written the trail. My phone rang again. I answered, my voice neutral. "This is Avery Sloan," the caller said, her voice crackling with distance, yet unmistakably sharp. "Morgan, I heard about the packet. I have the packet." Her tone was grim. "I kept my copies, Morgan. I keep everything, just like I taught you. The page after my signature in that packet, it is not the page I signed. They used a support memo from the Lantern Bridge after-action review. They clipped my signature page and attached it to a falsified award packet." The relief was profound. "Thank you, Colonel," I said. "You don't know what this means." "I am not doing this for you, Morgan," she snapped, but there was a tremor of sympathy beneath the steel. "I am doing it because I am not going to let some major use my career as a stepping stone for his own lies." The call ended, leaving me in the silence of the townhouse. The red herring had been exposed. The signature wasn't a betrayal, it was the smoking gun. Tyler had tried to use my mentor to validate his theft, and in doing so, he had invited the only person who would never let a lie go unpunished into the room. I felt a surge of energy. This was not a revenge I had manufactured, it was a consequence they had cultivated. Every act of deception, every manipulation, every shred of false documentation was leading them toward a reckoning they had never anticipated. The next morning, the sun was bright. I walked to the installation, feeling the ground beneath me shift. I saw Tyler's car again, but this time, it looked like the prop of a fraud. I didn't look at it. I was focused on the office of the Inspector General. Ortiz was waiting, the folder now thick with the documents I had provided. "You were right," he said, his voice clipped. Sloan provided the original routing sheet. The signature page in the packet submitted for Tyler Hale is a composite. It was digitally altered and then physically attached to the narrative pages. We have a forensic report on the document manipulation. I nodded, feeling a hollow sort of triumph. I hadn't wanted to prove they were criminals, but they had left me no other choice. They had taken my work and my reputation, and they had tried to bury me with them. But they had forgotten that a grave was only a place to hide, something you were afraid would come back. "I am ready to testify to the board," I said. Ortiz looked at me, a hint of admiration in his expression. "It will be a formal administrative hearing, Colonel. Attendance will be restricted to the panel, counsel, witnesses, and directly involved parties, but the findings may become part of the official record. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" "I have spent my entire life being scrutinized," I said, looking him in the eye. "I am finally prepared to be the one asking the questions." I left the headquarters, the afternoon traffic beginning to thicken. I had a clear path forward. The hearing was weeks away, but I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. I drove home, the radio playing a steady rhythm. Maya was in the kitchen. I walked in, set my bag down, and stood for a moment, listening to the sound of the world as it should be, quiet, predictable, and honest. "The investigation is moving," I said. She turned around, her face softening. "Are you okay, Morgan?" I thought about the packet, the forged signature, and the way Tyler had tried to build a life on the ghost of my career. I thought about Nancy's emails and Kenneth's cold, calculated advice. "I am better than okay," I said. "I am finally standing on solid ground." I went to the balcony, looking out over the suburban sprawl. The lights were beginning to twinkle, each one a different life, a different story, a different truth. For so long I had been the sister who stayed in the dark so Tyler could hold the light. But the light was finally shifting. I knew they wouldn't stop here. They would try to manipulate the hearing, but the paper trail was not a family drama, it was an integrity issue. And that was the one language the army spoke fluently. I went back inside and closed the door, the click of the lock, a definitive, final sound. I was done with the games. I was ready for the record to be the only thing that spoke for me. The air inside Ortiz's office felt thick, pressurized by the silence that followed his revelation. He slid a folder toward me, the edges worn from excessive handling. Inside, printed in clear, objective font, were the results of a forensic review of documents Kenneth's counsel had produced after a formal preservation request, together with files recovered from the shared family account Tyler had used for his award packet. My breath hitched as I traced the digital breadcrumbs. There, in a draft dated 3 months before the promotion ceremony, were comments embedded in a document that mirrored the structure of my own work. My father had left a trail of digital fingerprints that made my skin crawl. Change this phrase. "It sounds too much like Morgan's version," he had written. Another comment beneath it read, "Say developed, not borrowed." The professional, stoic facade of the man I had once called a hero crumbled in my mind, replaced by the reality of a strategist who viewed his children as assets to be managed. I stared at the screen, my pulse a frantic bird in my chest. He wasn't just fixing grammar, he was actively erasing me to make room for his preferred narrative. I felt the familiar weight of old memories settling in the photos on the mantle where I was cropped out, the trophies I had been told to hand over to Tyler because he needed them more. It had not been an accident. It had been a lifetime of planned subtraction. Ortiz watched my face, his expression unreadable. "I have the metadata, Colonel. This confirms the authorship originated with your father. We have cross-referenced the edits with his personal laptop access logs." I looked at the folder, then at the man across from me. I had held onto a thread of hope that my parents were merely misguided, that they had fallen for Tyler's charm and were protecting him out of a blind, twisted kind of love. The documents proved otherwise. They were architects of the deception. They had designed a system where I was the shadow, intended to be perpetually eclipsed by the brother they were desperate to build into a legend. I recalled the voicemail Kenneth left me in the spring, the one I had saved in the evidence ledger. "Let Tyler have this one," he had pleaded, his voice dripping with an insufferable, patriarch-like authority. "You already have enough. Do not destroy his future over a few paragraphs." I looked at Ortiz. He viewed the work as a resource to be distributed at his convenience. I was never a person to him. I was simply the surplus value he could strip away to balance his own ledger. Ortiz turned to a secondary folder, his movements methodical. "We also have the laptop belonging to your mother, Nancy. We found a family statement, drafted weeks ago, designed to be released if you ever raised an official complaint. It describes you in ways that would make a medical board question your fitness for duty." I felt a cold shiver pass through me. The audacity was breathtaking. They hadn't reacted to my complaint. They had anticipated it and prepared a preemptive strike. They had weaponized my mental health recovery, twisting my vulnerability into a weapon they intended to aim at my career. Every intimate detail I had shared with my mother during the darkest days after my deployment had been stored, weaponized, and filed away for the moment I finally stood up for myself. "It is a preemptive smear campaign," Ortiz said, closing the laptop. "They knew exactly who you were and what you had done. They did not wait for a reason to attack. They created the weapon because they knew the truth was a liability." The revelation was a hammer blow to the foundation of my life. I wasn't just fighting an ego-driven brother. I was fighting an entire institution of family, a collaborative machine that had spent years ensuring I remained a ghost. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, a strange, crystalline calm settled over me. They had forced me into a position where I had to choose between my career and my family, never imagining I would choose myself. I looked at Ortiz and nodded, the weight of the evidence grounding me. "This changes everything," I said, my voice steady. "It isn't just about the framework anymore. It is about the systemic attempt to disable an officer of the United States Army using private, protected information." "You are right," he replied, leaning back. "The board will need to address this as a security and integrity issue. This goes beyond family drama. This is about professional sabotage." I stood, the folders heavy with the wreckage of my past. I realized then that my parents had never truly believed their own lies. They had built the deception with careful, malicious intent, knowing full well that if I ever spoke, the truth would be the only thing that could save me. I had been their target for decades, but I was also the only person who knew exactly how the machine worked. I walked out of the office, the hallway light bright and unrelenting. The world outside looked the same, but my perception of it had shifted permanently. I was no longer the sister who had to be quiet. I was the officer who held the map to their destruction, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to follow it to the end. The folders I carried felt like lead. I walked out of Ortiz's office, the hallway light bright and unrelenting. My world had narrowed down to the evidence in my hands, a jagged collection of truths that rendered every memory of my parents into something unrecognizable. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the parking lot stretching out before me like a desolate gray expanse. Maya was waiting by my car, her face a mirror of my own exhaustion. She took one look at my expression and didn't ask a single question. She simply opened the door, letting me slide into the seat before she started the ignition. I looked at the dashboard clock, the digital numbers flickering in the sun, and realized I couldn't go back to the townhouse yet. The space felt too small, too filled with the weight of what I had just learned. I needed to move, to breathe, to find a sense of motion that matched the chaos in my mind. Captain Leah Brooks was the reason I didn't succumb to the urge to go home and sleep for a week. She arrived at the townhouse an hour later, looking like someone who had spent the last 24 hours hiding from a storm. She didn't look like an officer in uniform. She looked like a scared kid in civilian clothes, her hair pulled back in a messy knot that suggested she hadn't slept at all. I opened the door and gestured for her to enter. She stepped inside, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting to find Tyler lurking in the corners. She held a printed email chain against her chest, the papers wrinkled from how tightly she gripped them. "Colonel," she started, her voice breaking. "He called me again. He told me to wipe the training deck, all the local copies, everything. He said it was just a technical update, but the tone, it wasn't an update. It was an order to destroy evidence." I led her to the kitchen, the smell of leftover coffee still hanging in the air. I poured her a cup, waiting for her to find her footing. I had seen the emails she sent me before, but seeing her here, in the flesh, brought the stakes into sharp relief. This wasn't just about my framework anymore. It was about the way Tyler was using the chain of command to silence a subordinate who knew too much. "Show me," I said, sitting across from her. She pushed the papers across the table. Tyler had sent an email to the entire training department, instructing them to remove the reference to my name and replace it with a generic operational model. In a follow-up message, sent directly to Leah, he had warned her that her upcoming evaluation depended on her cooperation. He had written that loyalty was a core tenet of the unit, and that questioning a superior's methodology was an act of insubordination. "It is retaliation," I said, my voice cold. "It is textbook, and it is going to cost him his career." Leah looked at me, her eyes wet. "I'm scared, Colonel. He has the support of the Veterans Association. He has his father's connections. Who am I in all of this? I am just a captain who happened to find a training deck." "You are the one who is telling the truth," I said. "That is the only thing that matters. I will ensure this is part of the official investigation. Ortiz has the forensic audit logs. He already knows about the deletion requests." She let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension in her shoulders dropping an inch. "I didn't come here to ask you to save me. I came here to tell you that I am not going to let him do this to the next officer. I am going to file the complaint officially." I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with my own struggle. She was young and she was frightened, but she was choosing the harder, more honest path. I didn't offer her platitudes. I didn't promise her a clean, easy win. I simply nodded and pulled out my tablet, walking her through the process of submitting an official whistleblower report. We didn't talk about the family drama. We focused on the procedure, the timing, and the evidentiary requirements. Once she left, the townhouse returned to its quiet state, but the air felt charged. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was Tyler again. This time, the text was longer, a desperate attempt to frame the interaction with Leah as a misunderstanding. "Tell them I made a mistake," he wrote, his tone shifting between arrogance and plea. "If you pull this off, Mom sends everything. She has the medical files, the therapy notes, the private things you talked about in confidence. Don't make her do it." I stood there, the phone vibrating in my palm, and for the first time, I didn't feel the sting of the threat. I felt pity. He was dangling private information like a blunt instrument, oblivious to the fact that it was the very thing that would ensure he never worked in this organization again. I took a screenshot, forwarded it to Ortiz, and muted the conversation. I walked to the balcony, the evening air cool against my face. My parents were so convinced that they knew how to break me because they had spent 20 years defining what I could and could not handle. They didn't understand that the very things they thought would destroy me, my history, my recovery, my vulnerability, were the things that had made me the officer I was today. I hadn't hidden those parts of my life because I was ashamed. I had protected them because they were mine. I spent the rest of the night working on my own statement for the hearing. I wrote about the framework, about the email I had sent him, and about the clear, unambiguous boundary I had set back then. I didn't write about my parents. I didn't write about the childhood photos or the holidays where I was made to feel small. I wrote about the professional standards, the duty of an officer, and the reality of the evidence. I was not going to give the board a family soap opera. I was going to give them a record of professional misconduct. When the sun finally began to rise, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The exhaustion was still there, a dull ache in my limbs, but my mind was sharp. I was no longer fighting for their approval. I was fighting for the truth. I walked into the kitchen, Maya already standing by the stove. She handed me a cup of tea, her eyes soft. "You didn't sleep," she noted. "I need sleep," I admitted. "But first I need to finish this statement while the details are still clear." I looked at my phone. There were missed calls from Nancy, from my father, and from a few relatives who had been dragged into the fray. I didn't acknowledge a single one. I had moved beyond their sphere of influence, and I wasn't going back. I was the one who had written the framework, and I was the one who would ensure it was never stolen again. I stood at the window, watching the city wake up, feeling a sense of purpose that transcended the noise of my family. I had the facts, I had the evidence, and I had the strength. The hearing was ahead, the truth was mine, and I would hold it until the very end. They had nowhere left to hide, because I had mapped the trail, and I was holding the light. I turned back to the kitchen, picked up my bag, and headed for the door, my resolve fixed. The work was far from over, but the outcome had never been clearer. They had bet that I would disappear, and instead, I had decided to show them exactly who was in command. I walked out into the morning, the world waiting, and for the first time, I knew I was the one who was going to define what came next. The air inside the conference room at the installation headquarters was filtered, dry, and carried the faint metallic scent of ozone from the heavy equipment in the hallway. I sat at the mahogany table, my back straight, my gaze fixed on the blank wall opposite the door. Ortiz arrived first, carrying the thick, expanding folder that had become the centerpiece of my life. A moment later, the door handle turned, and Colonel Avery Sloan stepped inside. Seeing her felt like looking at a version of myself from the past, sharp, composed, and radiating a quiet intensity that had once guided my own career. She wore her uniform with the same effortless grace I remembered, though her face carried the lines of a woman who had spent years fighting battles no one else saw. She didn't look at me immediately. She walked to the table, placed a worn, green-tabbed folder down, and only then did she turn her eyes toward me. "Morgan," she said. Her voice remained as steady as the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. "Colonel Sloan," I responded, keeping my tone professional. It was strange to use her title, but in this room we were officers first. Ortiz cleared his throat, setting the tone for the meeting. "Colonel Sloan has volunteered to review the documentation regarding the award packet submitted by Major Tyler Hale. She has brought her own records." Sloan didn't waste time. She opened her folder, the blue-inked notations she was famous for immediately visible on the pages. She kept her routing sheets. She had always kept them, a habit born from a deep distrust of digital migration and the instability of the system. I watched as she laid out a series of documents, their edges softened by time. One routing sheet, in particular, caught my attention, the one I had signed myself 6 years ago, during the chaos of Lantern Bridge. "I signed that memo," Sloan said, her finger tracing a section of the document. I endorsed the framework as a collective effort, led by Major Morgan Hale, with input from the entire planning team. There was no mention of Tyler Hale in the original, because Tyler Hale was not part of that operation. She pushed the paper toward Ortiz. "Look at the signature page in the current packet." I stood up and moved to the table, looking down at the forgery. It was a digital ghost. The signature was mine, but the context had been stolen. The endorsement lifted from a document that had nothing to do with the work my brother was currently claiming. "They used a support memo I wrote for a completely different administrative action," Sloane continued, her voice devoid of emotion. "They cut it, scanned it, and grafted it onto the fraudulent narrative. It is a textbook manipulation of official records." The room felt small, the walls closing in as the reality of the deception settled over us. I thought of my parents, sitting in their living room, meticulously cutting and pasting a career out of my life, oblivious to the fact that they were constructing a monument to their own eventual destruction. They had been so certain that their status as a military family would insulate them from the scrutiny that followed regular people. They had been wrong. Ortiz turned to me. "Does this align with your ledger, Colonel?" "It does," I said, my voice unwavering. "It aligns with the dates in my notebook. The initialed pages, the annexes, the planning logs, they all corroborate the fact that this framework was created while the planning team was under my direct supervision. Tyler was never on that team." Sloane looked at me then, her gaze intense. "I did not realize he was using it until the general reached out," she said. "I am sorry I didn't see it sooner." I shook my head. "You were the one who taught me to focus on the mission, not the politics, Colonel. I was the one who kept it quiet to protect the team. I'm the one who didn't speak up. That was my mistake." As if on cue, my phone lit up with a notification. It was an audit log report Ortiz had requested earlier, revealing that a group chat between Tyler, Kenneth, and Nancy had been active minutes after the ceremony ended. The contents had been recovered through a digital forensic sweep of the cloud accounts, and the dialogue was damning. "Wipe the old versions now," Kenneth had commanded in the chat logs. "Leah has one copy," Tyler replied, his tone frantic. "If Morgan speaks publicly, use the treatment story," Nancy had advised. "People already think she left, and if she tries to challenge this, we tell them she is still struggling with the deployment." Seeing those words written out, seeing the coordination of my own family as they plotted to dismantle my reputation, felt like standing on a fault line. They weren't just protecting him. They were systematically preparing to destroy me if I ever refused to be the sister who stayed in the dark. Ortiz read the messages, his face hardening. "This goes beyond attribution theft," he remarked. "This is coordinated harassment and the deliberate falsification of evidence to influence an administrative process." The weight of the room seemed to shift. We were no longer talking about a brother taking credit. We were talking about a familial conspiracy that reached into the heart of the institution. My father, the veteran who lectured everyone on honor, had been orchestrating the cover-up. My mother, the volunteer who spoke of sacrifice, had been the one to draft the lies meant to keep me quiet. I looked at Sloane, then back at Ortiz. "I am not asking for a favor," I said, my voice clear and loud. "I am asking for the board to review the entire history of this packet. I want the investigation to encompass the original submission, the alterations, and the attempts to silence the whistleblowers." "We will include everything," Ortiz assured me. As I walked out of the conference room later that afternoon, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't known since I first started this. I had the evidence, I had the witnesses, and I had the resolve to see the truth through to the final line. I didn't need their permission anymore. I didn't need their apology. I only needed the record to be clean. I walked to the installation gate, the afternoon sun, a warm, persistent weight on my shoulders. I felt the pulse of the building, the lifeblood of an organization that I had served for nearly 2 decades. I realized then that my life was not a shadow, not a background player in someone else's drama. I was the one who had written the framework, and I was the one who would ensure it was never stolen again. I arrived at the townhouse, Maya already waiting with dinner. She saw my face and poured the bourbon without being asked. "It's done," I said, and for the first time in years, the words held the weight of completion. We sat in the quiet of the evening, the blue notebook sitting on the table like a testament to the work I had done. I thought about the career I had built, the lives I had helped save, and the way I had finally managed to reclaim my own name. The hearing would be difficult, and there would be more lies to navigate, but the truth was no longer a secret I had to protect. It was a weapon I was ready to use. I didn't need to be the golden child. I didn't need the family who had spent decades waiting for me to fail. I had my own life, and I had finally built a house that they didn't have the keys to. The silence in the kitchen felt less like a void, and more like a space where I could finally breathe. I went to the window, watching the stars begin to emerge, each one a different life, a different story, a different truth. I thought of Tyler, sitting in his living room, probably waiting for the next text, the next lie, the next excuse. He would never know what it felt like to actually be an officer, to actually know the work you had done, to actually be able to look in the mirror and know that your accomplishments were yours. That was the tragedy of his life. Not that he would lose his promotion, but that he had spent his entire existence trying to be someone else. The next morning, I stood at the headquarters entrance. I was there to submit my final affidavit, the document that would tie everything together for the board. As I walked to the door, I passed a group of officers, their uniforms sharp and purposeful. I was one of them. I had always been one of them. I reached the office and handed over the final packet. The clerk, a young man who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, took it with a nod. "Colonel Hale, we have the schedule for the hearing. It will be in 2 weeks. I acknowledged him and turned, feeling a sense of peace that had nothing to do with the outcome. I had done my part. The rest was up to the system I had trusted my entire life to. I walked out into the crisp, morning air, the world waiting for the truth to be told. I had the facts, I had the evidence, and I had the strength. The hearing was ahead, the truth was mine, and I would hold it until the very end. They had nowhere left to hide, because I had mapped the trail, and I was holding the light. I turned back to the gate, the world ahead of me, promising and wide. I was the sister, yes, but I was also the officer who had saved more lives than Tyler had ever dreamed of, and I was the one who was going to make sure that the truth was the only thing standing when the smoke cleared. The morning light began to bleed into the room, soft and gray. I opened my eyes, the plan already forming, the path forward clear and unshakable. I was the one who had mapped the framework, and I was the one who would ensure it was never stolen again. I was the one who had survived the desert, and I was the one who would survive the hearing. I was the one who had earned the salute, and I was the one who would hold the line. And they had nowhere left to hide. I walked back to the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. I was the sister, yes, but I was also the officer who had saved more lives than Tyler had ever dreamed of, and I was the one who was going to make sure that the truth was the only thing standing when the smoke cleared. The morning was a fresh start, a clean page in a long story. I stood at the window, watching the world awaken, the promise of the coming day a challenge I was ready to face. I had the facts, I had the evidence, and I had the strength. The hearing was ahead. The truth was mine, and I would hold it until the very end. They had nowhere left to hide, because I had mapped the trail, and I was holding the light. I turned back to the kitchen, the world waiting, and for the first time, I knew I was the one who was going to define what came next. I walked out into the morning, the world waiting, and for the first time, I knew I was the one who was going to define what came next. The hearing room was smaller than I had anticipated, a sterile chamber of soundproof tiles and fluorescent lights that buzzed with a low, unrelenting hum. No general spectators were allowed. The room was limited to the 3 senior officers on the panel, the recording secretary, assigned counsel, scheduled witnesses, and the individuals directly named in the review. My parents had been permitted to sit in the back because both were expected to answer questions about the security complaint and the altered records. I took my seat at the table, the blue field notebook laid flat before me. Across the aisle, Tyler sat with his own representation. He looked polished, his dress blues immaculate, but the constant twitch of his left eye revealed the frayed edges of his composure. My parents sat in the back row, their faces hardened into identical masks of righteous indignation. I refused to look at them. I kept my gaze forward, anchored by the small, framed photo of the Lantern Bridge planning team I had placed on the table as a silent reminder of why I was here. Major General Ward arrived exactly on time, her presence commandingly quiet as she took her place as the presiding officer. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the static of unspoken history. I stood, my boots clicking against the linoleum, and swore the oath with a steady, resonant voice that felt entirely my own. When the council began, he pushed the award narrative toward Tyler. Major Hale, you have asserted that you were the sole architect of the Operation Lantern Bridge evacuation framework. Can you explain the origin of the term 4-minute quiet window? Tyler leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. It was a concept I developed after reviewing the historical failures of similar operations, he said, his voice smooth and practiced. I synthesized the data and refined the timing to ensure maximum safety for the personnel involved. I held my breath. I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The council then turned to me. Colonel Hale, you have provided a sanitized memo dated 2 years prior to Tyler's research. Could you explain the context of this document? I stood, my posture perfectly erect. I prepared that memo at the request of my brother to assist him with his academic research on leadership under communication failures. I explicitly included the term 4-minute quiet window as a specific technical element of the framework I had developed during the Lantern Bridge operation. I sent that document with a written instruction that it was for study purposes only, and not to be presented as his own work. Tyler's composure fractured. That is a subjective interpretation, he interrupted, his voice rising. She gave me permission to use the lessons learned. She has always been the one to hide her accomplishments, and now she is trying to rewrite the past because she cannot handle seeing me succeed. The panel members remained stone-faced, their gazes shifting between us like observers at a tennis match. The lead panelist motioned for quiet. Tyler's defensive maneuver, the old narrative of the bitter, unstable sister, was falling flat against the weight of the metadata. The council projected the document onto the screen, showing the exact timestamps of the file creation, the author tags that still carried my name, and the tracked changes my father had mistakenly left in a draft found on the shared family cloud. Kenneth Hale's face went white. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his fingers gripping the back of the chair in front of him until his knuckles turned ivory. Nancy, sitting next to him, stared at her own hands, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Captain Leah Brooks was called next. She walked to the stand, her steps measured, her uniform perfectly aligned. She didn't look at Tyler. She spoke directly to the board, detailing the threats to her evaluation and the direct orders he had given her to erase the citations. Every word she spoke dismantled another layer of his defense. She was not a subordinate who had misunderstood an order. She was a witness who had documented a pattern of coercion. Nancy was called shortly after. The council presented her with the security complaint she had drafted and signed. When asked why she had described me as an estranged civilian with a history of instability, she faltered. "I was worried," she whispered, her voice cracking for the benefit of the room. "I was only trying to protect my son from a volatile situation." The lead panelist leaned forward, his voice a gravelly monotone. "Mrs. Hale, you signed a document asserting that an active duty officer was an imposter. Was this based on personal knowledge Or was it a calculated attempt to disrupt an integrity investigation? She crumbled, the tears finally coming, but they held no power here. They were just water on a floor that was already flooding. The weight of the evidence, the email chains, the forensic reports of the forged signature, the voicemail from my father admitting he had helped rewrite the narrative, all of it converged into an undeniable truth. I watched Tyler. He was no longer the golden child. He was just a man caught in the machinery of his own ambition. When I was finally allowed to speak, I didn't turn to look at my family. I spoke to the panel, to the history I had served, and to the truth that had taken 6 years to find its way out of the shadows. I do not ask for a verdict of malice, I said, my voice resonating in the silent chamber. I ask for the record to be restored. The framework was a product of a team under fire, and it deserves to be credited to the people who were there, not the person who happened to have the right last name. When I finished, the silence lasted for 10 seconds. It was a vacuum of sound where the entire reality of my life seemed to hang, suspended. The lead panelist finally nodded, his expression unreadable. This hearing is adjourned pending the final review of the supplemental chain of custody documents. A decision will be rendered in due course. I gathered my notebook, the leather cool and solid beneath my palm. I stood, tucked my chair in, and finally turned toward the back row. My father stood, his face a mask of grief and fury, while my mother looked past me into the empty space where her fantasy had finally ended. I felt nothing but a profound, quiet detachment. I walked out of the room, leaving them with the wreckage they had built. As I reached the hallway, my phone buzzed. It was a final, frantic message from Tyler, sent the moment he walked out of the chamber. Tell them I made a mistake, or Mom sends everything. I stopped in the middle of the corridor, captured the message with its timestamp, and forwarded it to Ortiz without replying. Then I preserved the conversation in the evidence folder and muted Tyler's number, who was already standing by the exit, waiting for me. He looked at the screen, then at me. He may have turned an integrity hearing into a coercion case with one sentence, Ortiz said, his voice flat. This will not help him. I walked to the entrance, the air of the installation rushing in to greet me. The world was still turning, but for the first time it was turning in the direction I was facing. I didn't look back at the hearing room or the family that had become a stranger to me. I walked out into the afternoon, the sky vast and open, knowing that the truth was finally standing tall, and for the first time in my life I was standing with it. The weight of the uniform was no longer a burden of expectations. It was a simple, honorable weight of duty, and I was exactly where I needed to be. The 3 weeks following the hearing felt like breathing underwater, a dense, pressurized weight where every sound seemed magnified, every silence heavy with implication. I kept my routine, maintaining the rhythm of my life with the disciplined persistence I had cultivated in the desert. My days were spent at my desk, my nights were quiet meals with Maya, and I refused to let the anxiety of the pending decision consume the hours I had fought so hard to reclaim. I did not sit by the phone, and I did not scour the internet for leaks from the board. I trusted the process I had set in motion, a procedural certainty that provided the only stability I possessed. Tyler's final attempt to reach me came through his counsel, a formal, sterile correspondence delivered to my home address. He claimed that the fallout from the integrity review had already ruined his marriage and compromised his standing within his social circle. He asked, in a tone that veered between bargaining and entitlement, if I would consider issuing a statement suggesting the framework had been a joint effort rather than his unilateral claim. He framed it as a way to save his career and spare our parents the public humiliation of his discharge. I read the letter at the kitchen table, the paper smooth and thick. Erin had already moved out, and according to the documents I had received from Ortiz, she had been fully cooperative during the investigation, clarifying that Tyler had lied to her from the beginning about the origin of the framework. She had opted out of the chaos, choosing to salvage her own dignity rather than play a role in his grand, delusional theater. I did not respond. I simply filed the document in the evidence folder. It was yet another brick in the wall he had built around himself, and I was not going to be the one to knock it down. A week later, I was walking to my car when Kenneth appeared near the entrance of the public library. He looked diminished, his posture less rigid, his face drawn. He moved with a slight limp, his arthritic knee clearly bothering him, yet his expression remained as sharp and judgmental as ever. He stood directly in my path, forcing me to stop. "Morgan," he said, his voice devoid of the usual command, "you are going to ruin this family. Do you have any idea how many people are watching? The Veterans Association has already sent a letter of inquiry regarding my honorary board seat. Your mother hasn't left the house in days." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who had always demanded everything while offering nothing. "I have a father who has 2 children," I said, my voice steady enough to carry over the sound of the traffic on the main road. "But he only ever fought for one. You made your choice years ago when you helped him rewrite my history. You don't get to lecture me on family now." I walked past him, refusing to wait for a retort. I didn't look back when he called my name, his voice thin and cracking against the wind. I didn't care if he had 2 children or 10. I only cared that I was finally the one in control of my own life. And that was a victory that transcended his approval. Nancy's final attempt was a frantic email sent to my legal address, pleading with me to consider the emotional toll on the extended family. She claimed that my refusal to reach an out-of-court settlement was a sign of a heart grown cold during my time in service. I forwarded it to Ortiz without comment. Her manipulation had lost its edge. It was just noise now, a background static I could easily tune out. The decision from the board arrived on a Tuesday in January, a day as gray and biting as the one I had first received the notification of the integrity review. I had been prepared for a dramatic conclusion, but the reality was a series of official documents delivered via courier. Tyler's promotion was formally vacated, the award narrations were retracted, and he was issued an adverse findings report, citing integrity violations, retaliation, and attempted destruction of official records. The separation process had been initiated, and his departure from the Army would be conducted with no retirement honors and no formal ceremony. The finality of the words was staggering. It wasn't a win in the sense of joy, it was a win of consequence. Every decision he had made, every lie he had told, and every order he had issued to Leah had been logged, verified, and found wanting. He was being forced out not because of what I had done, but because of what he had chosen to do. Kenneth and Nancy lost their grip on the social spheres they had used to manufacture their importance. The Veterans Association conducted a review, and Kenneth's honorary board seat was revoked. His reputation, the one he had spent years burnishing through his connections, began to fray as the truth of his involvement in the fraudulent paperwork became common knowledge among his peers. Nancy was relieved of her roles in the military family organization, the board citing her direct harassment of a serving officer and the falsification of security documents. I sat in the quiet of my living room, the documents laid out before me. The house was calm, no one was screaming, no one was demanding, and no one was telling me who I had to be. The official archives regarding Operation Lantern Bridge were corrected. The records now listed the framework as the Operation Lantern Bridge Team Protocol, with me as the lead integrator and the entire planning team named in the primary annex. Leah Brooks was exonerated, her evaluation corrected, and she was moved to a new unit where she wouldn't be under the influence of Tyler's circle. I received a brief professional email from the general's office, acknowledging the correction of the record. It was the only validation I had ever really wanted. In the final week of the process, Tyler and my parents had one last conference call, permitted by their counsel to discuss the division of the remaining property and the logistics of Tyler's move into a rental apartment. I did not participate, but I was told by the lawyer that the call ended in disaster. Tyler had blamed Kenneth and Nancy for the failure of his strategy, claiming that if they had just pushed harder or been more subtle, he would have retained his position. Nancy had turned on Kenneth for his clumsy handling of the track changes, and Kenneth had disowned them both for their incompetence. They had built a golden child out of lies, and now they were left in the ruins of the home they had constructed. The family that had insisted on absolute loyalty had fallen apart the moment the sacrifice required honesty. I stood in the center of the kitchen, the sunlight reflecting off the floor. I thought of the framework I had created, the way I had once hoped to name it after the team, and how I had been told by the brass at the time that such things were too complex for a single officer to claim. I had known better then, and I knew better now. I had the truth, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. I didn't have to apologize for my existence, and I didn't have to carry their shame. I took a deep breath, the air in the room feeling light and clean. I was the sister, yes, but I was also the officer who had saved more lives than Tyler had ever dreamed of, and I was the one who was going to make sure that the truth was the only thing standing when the smoke cleared. The morning was a fresh start, a clean page in a long story. I stood at the window, watching the world awaken, the promise of the coming day, a challenge I was ready to face. I had the facts, I had the evidence, and I had the strength. The hearing was ahead, the truth was mine, and I would hold it until the very end. They had nowhere left to hide, because I had mapped the trail, and I was holding the light. I turned back to the kitchen, the world waiting, and for the first time, I knew I was the one who was going to define what came next. I walked out into the morning, the world waiting, and for the first time, I knew I was the one who was going to define what came next. The brass key sat on the kitchen table, a dull, unremarkable object that had once been the only way I could access my own childhood. Beside it lay the final correspondence from my mother, a single sheet of stationery with a handwritten scrawl that mocked the very idea of reconciliation. "If you walk away now, you are the one destroying this family," she had written. I stared at the metal, remembering the hours I had spent hiding in that house, waiting for the storm of their expectations to pass, and realized I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no guilt, only the quiet, cold realization that I had never truly belonged there. I did not drive to the house to confront them one last time. I did not call to offer a final, stinging retort. I simply placed the key in an envelope, addressed it to their lawyer, and walked to the mailbox. The metal clanged as it dropped into the darkness, a sound of absolute finality that resonated in my chest. Maya and Isaac were waiting at the townhouse for dinner, their presence in the kitchen a testament to the life I had built on my own terms. They did not pry into the contents of the letter or ask if I was sad. They simply poured the wine, set the table, and treated me like the person I was, rather than the daughter I was expected to be. I watched them interact, Isaac laughing at a story Maya told about her chaotic shift in the emergency room, and understood that I had finally found my real family. These were people who cared for me because of the person I stood as, not because of the role I played in their grand, fractured design. The days that followed were surprisingly quiet. Tyler had officially exited the service, his departure as unceremonious as the end of a long, bad dream. He moved into a small apartment in a city 3 hours away, taking a position in a logistics firm where no one knew his name or the history he had tried to claim. I saw him once, in the reflection of a storefront window as I walked to the grocery store. He looked smaller, his shoulders slumped beneath a coat that didn't fit right. He didn't see me, and I kept walking, disappearing into the crowd without a second thought. He was just a man now, stripped of the rank he had never earned and the golden image he had stolen. My parents remained in the house that had been the stage for my upbringing, but the stage was empty. Kenneth was no longer welcome at the Veterans Association, and Nancy's social schedule had vanished, the rumors of their manipulation proving more resilient than their public reputations. I didn't need to check on them to know they were struggling. The silence was the consequence of their own choices. They had valued the appearance of perfection over the reality of their children, and they were now left with the inevitable result of that trade. In April, I stood before a group of young lieutenants and captains for a leadership seminar, the room filled with the scent of fresh coffee and the low murmur of eager, attentive voices. I began the session by projecting the updated Operation Lantern Bridge Team protocol onto the screen. Every name was there: Isaac, the medical staff, the planning team, and the logistics officers who had kept the lines moving when the world was coming apart. I didn't tell a story about my family. I didn't talk about the struggle or the stolen credit. I talked about the importance of attribution and the responsibility a leader had to elevate the people who did the work. I spoke about the necessity of standing behind the truth, especially when it was inconvenient, and the fact that an officer's integrity was not a commodity to be traded for a promotion. As the presentation ended, the room stayed silent for a long moment, the impact of the names on the screen settling over the young officers. When they finally stood, it was not because they had to, but because they understood that this was what leadership looked like. I was packing my materials when Major General Ward approached me. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes held a spark of genuine respect. "The briefing was excellent, Colonel," she said, her tone professional. "It is good to see the record corrected." I nodded, feeling a quiet, grounded strength. "It was the right thing to do, General," I said. She lingered for a moment, looking toward the door. "I heard about the board's final decision," she added. "The system is flawed, and it often takes a great deal of courage to hold it accountable. You have that courage, Morgan." I walked out of the auditorium and into the spring sunshine, the air thick with the promise of change. Ward's acknowledgement was not a victory lap. It was the closing of a chapter. I realized then that I had spent years waiting for their validation, for the moment they would finally see me, but their eyes had never mattered. The only eyes that mattered were the ones that watched me now, the officers who would take the lessons I taught and build something honest with them. I arrived home and found the archive box sitting in the center of the living room. I pulled out the blue notebook, the pages stiff and familiar. I didn't lock it away as if it were a secret. I placed it in a wooden box, the history of Lantern Bridge preserved in its rightful place. It was no longer a piece of evidence, it was a record, a ledger of a time when I had been tested and had not faltered. Maya and Isaac were waiting in the kitchen, the sound of music drifting through the townhouse. I walked in, feeling the rhythm of a life that belonged entirely to me. I took my phone, looked at the screen for a moment, and then powered it off. The world of messages, threats, and attempts to control me no longer required my attention. I understood finally that my legacy was not defined by Tyler's failures or the disappointment of my parents. It was defined by the way I lived, the way I commanded, and the way I treated the people who depended on me. I had survived the desert, and I had survived the hearing, and I had done it all without ever needing to diminish anyone else. As I sat down with my friends, the conversation drifting between the mundane and the meaningful, I felt a sense of arrival. For the first time, I did not have to disappear so that the people at my table could feel important. I was enough, just as I was Colonel Morgan Hale, the officer who held the line, the friend who chose her own family, and the woman who had finally learned that the most honorable thing you could do was to be exactly who you had fought to become. The evening progressed in a blur of laughter and honest, easy talk. I watched the way the light played off the walls, the way the shadows had finally stopped chasing me. I had spent so much of my life in the shadow of my brother's ambition, never realizing that I had the power to simply walk into the sun. I looked at the blue notebook on the table, an artifact of a life lived in the shadows. I reached out and brushed my fingers against the spine, a small, quiet gesture of recognition. I hadn't just survived. I had prevailed, not by changing who I was, but by insisting that the world recognize the person I had always been. The night air was warm, a welcome shift from the cold of the previous months. I went out to the balcony to watch the city, the lights glowing with a promise that felt real for the first time. I didn't worry about my parents. I didn't worry about Tyler. They were simply people, living the consequences of the stories they'd invented, while I was living the truth. I thought about the young lieutenants in the training room, the way they looked at me with expectation and hope. That was the legacy, the one I had actually built. I was a teacher now, a guide, an officer who had walked through the fire and had decided that the most important thing I could offer them was not a story of perfection, but a story of persistence. I went back inside, the warmth of the house a stark contrast to the emptiness of the years behind me. I sat down at the table, my glass full, my conscience clear. I had the truth, and for the first time in my life, that was all I would ever need. I smiled, a small, genuine expression that didn't feel forced or practiced, and raised my glass to the people sitting around me. We were a family, forged in the fires of our own choices, and it was a family I was finally, truly proud of. I looked at the clock on the wall, the time slipping into the late hours, and felt no desire to be anywhere else. I was home. I was whole. And I was finally, unequivocally, myself. The house was filled with the sound of music, a melody that felt like a beginning rather than an end. I closed my eyes, letting the sound wash over me, the memory of the salute still fresh in my mind. It wasn't the salute of a daughter or a sister. It was the salute of an officer to an officer. And in the end, that was all that ever really mattered. I didn't have to carry their shame anymore, and I didn't have to hide my own strength. The truth was out. The record was clean, and the future was wide, open, and entirely, beautifully my own. You have walked through the fire of this story, watching how the truth can finally dismantle even the most carefully constructed lies. If there is one lesson you must take from this, it is that your identity is not something you negotiate with those who refuse to see you. You do not owe your achievements, your past, or your peace of mind to people who have spent a lifetime deciding that you are only valuable when you are small or silent. True integrity is not found in keeping the peace at the expense of your own existence. It is found in the quiet, unrelenting courage to define your own record. When you stop disappearing to make others comfortable, you do not lose your family. You simply stop living in a house that was never meant to hold your spirit. Never let someone else's fear of your success become the reason you hide your light, because the only person who can truly rob you of your dignity is the one you allow to dictate your worth. You are the architect of your own history, and you are the only one authorized to sign your own name to the work you have done. It is time to look at the stories you have been told about yourself and decide which ones are yours, and which ones were only ever meant to hold you back. Have you ever felt like you were shrinking your life just to keep someone else from feeling threatened? And if so, what is one truth you are ready to stand for today?